Welcome to Kubernetes SIG Architecture for Thursday, March 28th, 2019. You will start with the agenda. You can get to the agenda by going to bit.ly/sig-architecture. So if you're listening or if you're following along now, that's an easy way to get to it. I should go ahead and drop the agenda into the comments here. We've got a whole bunch of things. As you remember, one of the things that we're doing different now from SIG architecture meetings in the past is we're going to report out on a bunch of the work that's been going on and maybe have some discussions on it. But a lot of the work now isn't debating topics here. It's things that have been happening in other meetings, in other places, and we're going to report and talk a little bit about that now. Today, you're going to see some things about conformance and code organization, which are two of the sub-projects that we have. And there's been a fair amount of work that's been happening with those. And so for the first one, there has been the conformance sub-project work. Do we have somebody on who can talk about this? I think Brian put this on here, but I'm not sure if he's here or Tim, you wanted to?
Brian's here and I'm here.
Yeah, we're just still setting up our AV.
Okay.
So this call was pretty much, this week was just basically an overview of what we're working on, as well as walking through an example of a review. There was a lot of bike shedding around what it means for some of the issues related to Windows support. And we had a couple of action items. The key action items or takeaways that we needed was better documentation about what is supported, what is not supported. We currently have a punch list, and we need to amend that punch list. I believe Patrick was going to update that list. So that's the primary takeaway. I think as we progress further next week, we'll probably be actually doing more execution-oriented sort of grooming and talking about the items that are actually on the backlog. I think this week was more of a getting to know everybody and understanding. So.
Yeah, and I want to thank Tim. He's got everything organized. We've got a calendar invitation out. It's on the community calendar. Stuff's recorded. I'm not sure if you uploaded it yet, Tim, but you're working on getting everything uploaded. So we're going to have these tracked with videos and all that stuff. So if you want to follow along, it's easy to get involved in conformance, join the meetings, get the recordings if you miss it, and get involved. Thanks, Tim, for setting all that up.
I'll put a link to the recording inside the meeting notes here.
Brian, I think you put this on there. Did you have anything you wanted to add to this conformance work?
No, I just wanted to let people know that we did have the conformance subproject kickoff meeting. Thanks a lot to Tim, definitely. There was also the CNCF conformance working group meeting, and I think we're going to reevaluate whether those meetings are still needed. Now that the subproject is actually moving, it's a little bit difficult to have like different sets of people in different meetings. We have to rehash some of the same issues. So we're definitely going to reevaluate that. But yeah, if you're interested in helping with conformance, the subproject is now the place to do it. That's pretty much all I wanted to say about that.
Fantastic.
Brian, I'll just add that we're happy to volunteer to kill the CNCF meeting if you wanted to do something like every fourth, one meeting a month of the subproject would be focused on overarching conformance issues.
Well, yeah, I don't know that we even need one per month in the overarching issues. That's definitely something that's worth talking about. But yeah, thanks for offering a reduced cadence of the CNCF meeting, like quarterly or something, might make sense, so we can decide when we're ready for new initiatives or something like that. But at the moment, I would like to focus on onboarding the additional conformance test reviewer so we can make more progress on improving the conformance test coverage of the core pieces that are already part of the conformance scope.
Sounds good. Well, there's going to be a natural piece where if there's no agenda item several days before any CNCF meeting, we're going to cancel it anyway. But just reach out on the list if you want to more officially cancel it.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I think that's it with conformance, and now we can move into code organization, which you're going to see there's a bit of in the agenda today. The first thing we have up is actually the code organization subproject. Dim's kind of put together an overview document that's linked in the agenda. Dims, I'm not sure, can you walk us through this quickly?
Yes, how much time do I have, Matt?
You probably can have like 5 minutes, is that enough?
Okay, we can try.
If you take a little longer, that's fine. We'll keep it moving along.
Can everybody see what I have? The code
Yes,
element.
we can see your screen.
Okay.
Thank you.
So basically, what's happening right now is there is a bunch of people in, like, say, SIG cloud provider, a clusterized cycle, or SIG testing that are trying to split things out and organize the code base because they have a specific problem. For example, the SIG cloud provider is like trying to get things out as external cloud providers, just as an example. And the SIG testing is how do we run the end-to-end tests for some other repositories, in addition to the main KK repository. So that is what has been happening so far. So people are coordinating among themselves and not really organized around the SIG architecture itself. So there is work happening, but not directed work. So what we are trying to do here is, I think Clayton put together this mission statement. So we want to rely on automation over process to help developers. We want to have some nice stuff. And then we have to figure out why we are not having all the good stuff. So anyway, before that, end goals: better development experience, user experience, better control over dependencies, ownership of code. So is there anything that is missing from here? That's the main question that I have for anybody on this call. Are there things that you would like us to see? Please go add it to the end goal or chime in right now. So how do we do it? So we right now, the main things that we do is, like, one is new repositories under Kubernetes SIGs. The second one is pushing things to staging. And then related to that is the publishing bot. And then we have a couple of tools under Hack for protecting against stray imports that start having cross dependencies. Also, another ongoing issue that we have is how do we take care of dependencies and add new dependencies and delete existing dependencies. So Jordan has a KEP for that, which got approved as of this morning, and hopefully for 1.15 we'll be switching over to Go modules from GoDev. So yay, thanks, Jordan. Then the other thing that we've been using is the feature branches. We have to see what we've learned from it so far and how we can take that forward and get more people to using feature branches if that's the way we want to go. There is the next thing is the publishing bot is becoming very critical to the staging process, but there's only 3 of us working on this. Stefan and Nikita, and nowadays I'm helping with that as well. So this includes trying to figure out the code in the publishing bot repository itself, as well as how we are pushing things. Every time we create a new repository under staging, we have some trouble getting the publishing bot back up after creating that repository. So we are trying to add more validation under Hack scripts and things like that. So we need help here. We need more people to help with the publishing bot as well. So there's a bunch of existing issues. I'm not going to click on all of them. And there is a bunch of problems that we've documented as well. So simple example here is the end-to-end test requires importing all of KK. Then we've talked about things like another example I'll give you is we were shocked a couple of days ago when when a bug fix was made to one of the cloud providers, and that turned out to pull in 50,000 lines of code. Thankfully, not all of them went into the binary, but then we were shocked and surprised. So things like that happen, and not everybody is aware of all the changes that go in. So we need concentrate a set of people who are who want to do this kind of work. It's reorganizing a lot of the code, splitting things into repository and things like that. So to do, we don't have a label, we don't have a project board, we don't have a regular meeting. So that's where we want to start. We want to start organizing the work. We want to identify the people who are interested in this. So maybe what I'll do right now is, who is interested?
Hey, Dems,
Yes.
what are sort of if you had to name the one or two top skill sets or expertises to be able to participate in this, what do you see those as being? What is it familiar with the code base or review skills or whatnot? Sorry, Clayton, I totally jumped in front of you.
Right. So one is, I'll give you an example, right? So you need to know a little bit about how Kubernetes works, but mainly some Golang skills would be really helpful. We're not looking for anything more than that because, for example, just getting dependencies up and running, updating to newer dependencies of projects. Like I walked through somebody from India on how to update our Docker this morning. So, simple stuff, there is a lot of work, but there are more complicated stuff like we have two dependencies for notification, FS notify and inotify. Then that is more into like how the libraries work and can we collapse it into one library and things like that. So that's a little bit more complicated. So we can use the whole spectrum of skills, but we can start with whatever skills you can bring to the mix. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Brian, did you want to add anything more there?
Just a minute. Are we unmuted here?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think one thing we need to do is identify which things are high priority to make progress, which things need, and then which things need owners. And if we don't have owners who step up right away, we should create roles for those and advertise them, post them to the role board and whatnot. I do agree that Golang skills, like Go modules and understanding of how imports work and the problems with tangled dependencies or mismatching dependencies, mismatching versions, how we want to version code that we publish and all that stuff would be very helpful. All of this stuff has grown organically according to the needs of specific sub-efforts like the cloud provider effort or API machinery, or like we have some SIG storage stuff to talk about today. So, even just documenting how the existing stuff works and what the best practices are so that people in other SIGs who didn't create their mechanism originally at least can understand what mechanisms are available and which ones they should use in which situation and stuff like that. So we've discussed doing this for a long time, but a number of things are coming to a head, and Jordan's going to talk about some of the other recent ones like the Go modules work that Dim's mentioned. So yeah, we're getting some volunteers on the chat, so thanks for that. Put your names in the doc and how to reach you. That would be great. Thank you.
And this is Tim. I'm sorry, did I jump on anybody? I didn't see any hands up.
Mine's up. So I had a question. You mentioned staging in this doc a couple times. Staging is something that some people like and some people do not. Some people see as an interim step and some people see as a terminal location. Do you see staging, how do you see staging working inside of this effort? Do you see us moving things to it, moving things out of it?
Right. So I'll give you an example, right? For staging, the most recent thing that I did was move the CRI API into staging. But then what I want to happen is when CRI gets into GA, then it needs to move out of staging into its own repository. Does that help?
So I think, David, what I would say is staging the mechanics of staging, when staging should be used, how staging works today, making it work better is part of this effort. If we want to move away from staging, I think that would be a conclusion that would come out of people working on this effort as opposed to something we understand right now. I agree that there's not consensus on that. And honestly, you know, I don't know. We would have to have some kind of criteria, like what problem are we solving, I think, as opposed to, you know, moving individual things out when they're ready for specific reasons versus doing it wholesale.
Right. Then the other thing is people don't really know all the options that we have. Right now, we have a third-party directory in KK, and then we have opportunity to create new repositories under Kubernetes SIGs. So there are even people are hosting modules in their own GitHub orgs, and then we are rendering it, and so we can move some of those into Kubernetes SIGs as well. Then there is staging, of course. So, and all of them have trade-offs, right? Another trade-off that we were discussing this morning on the SIG node was there is a package called streaming, which people are using across the different CRI implementations, but ours is the source, and it's hard to render KK. So should it go into staging or should it go into a separate repository was what we were debating. So we have to kind of like come up with a checklist or some guidance of some kind to say, if this is the problem that you're facing, then go do this. That's part of what I envision for this work group.
So, if I understand it right, what we're probably going to end up doing here is just like we did with Conformance and the API reviews. We'll probably break off into a separate sub-meeting once we've got other people, and staging and priorities and all of these things will become topics and agendas, and we'll have issues and labels and boards as all of that work is worked on and then reported out through here. Is that right?
That's right. And then I think we figured out how to get approvals, who to get approvals from, and things like that, right? So we're going to get approvals from the SIG first and then bring it to, so we'll document those flows as well. So it's easier for people to do this, and we should not be the bottleneck there.
Fantastic.
So this is Tim. I just want to say real quickly, I support the effort of this overall thrust very much. I don't have a lot of time to contribute to it. But you can consider me a supporter, and I will help in any way that I can.
Thank you. The top level, easy button always helps. Thanks, Tim.
All right, Dims, did you have something else, or can we move on to the next item?
So shout out to Jordan. So one of the things that we are doing here would be involving external dependencies. So Jordan took the time to write up an entire doc as well. So let's.
Yeah, I put Go modules and the external dependencies things on the agenda, and Jordan said he could briefly summarize those for us.
Yeah, external dependencies is the next topic in the agenda. So if we're ready, we can move on to that.
Sure. So this is just a summary of this doc. Basically, we have a lot of external dependencies that are used a lot of different ways. And some of those are close to home in the Kubernetes org or in the CNCF, and some of those are big external projects that have their own release timelines and schedules and don't align well with our releases and our support cadence. And so this document is trying to first gather information about all of those dependencies and start to sort of take stock of where we are today, so that can inform ways we want to reduce external dependencies, ways we want to see if we can negotiate more aligned support policies, and so that it can inform any decisions that we make about possibly supporting a fourth release, or anything we want to do around our release support timeframes needs to be informed by the things we actually depend on. So take a look at this document if you are currently working on any of these efforts, to make sure that the things that you're doing are represented here so we can be aware of them. Or if you have information to contribute about some of these dependencies that we already have. So just really quickly, the categories are support policies for our existing dependencies. So you see things like Golang and etcd, and then other things that might be used in some cases like Docker, Containerd, Core DNS. We just want to make sure that we know if there are any gaps. If we say we support releases for 9 months, but we depend on something that only has a 1 month support window, then that's a problem that we need to figure out. So if you have information about some of the question marks here, please add it with citations. The next item is processes to make sure that when we ship, we are actually testing against the things we say we work with. And so probably the clearest example of this is the specific versions of Docker that we test against. But every external dependency we have adds a dimension to the test matrix. And so we want to figure out how we can actually test the things we say we support. The first two, the more painful and the more gaps we identify with the first two, the more we will be motivated to actually reduce our external dependencies. So that is an easy way to improve the situation, rather than pinning to specific versions of things, actually define APIs for the interactions. So that's been going on in a lot of areas for a long time. Things like CRI for container runtimes, CSI for storage, CNI for networks. But some of those efforts have not really progressed to stable. CRI in particular, I think is still alpha level, it might be beta level, but I think it's alpha level. And so it's hard to say that we're going to drop in-tree things in favor of an alpha level API. And so it may be alpha in name only. It may have actually been stable and unchanging for years now, but we need to do the work to get those APIs that we say we support characterized as stable, if they actually are, and we're going to depend on them that way. Other things in our release engineering toolchain, like the vendor management, I think next on the agenda is actually talking about the switch from GoDeps to Go modules. I'm sure there are other things that I'm missing, so please add to this list. If you know of tools that we are using that are unsupported or could be collapsed onto more standard tools, please help us get a good picture of our dependencies. And then the last item is similar to what Dims was talking about. If there are dependencies we have that aren't maintained or that we don't need anymore, and we could collapse, identifying those so that we can shard out the work to actually go do that would be good to gather. So please take a look at this, add any information that is missing, and yeah, we'll try to organize that, and then people who are interested in helping can jump on things that are understaffed on this.
Thanks for putting this together, Jordan. This is great to see. Are there any questions, any comments?
Who is interested?
I think I sent this out to the mailing list, and everyone on the list should have edit access. So yeah, please put your name, and ideally put your name beside like particular items here. If there's a particular dependency that you're familiar with and want to help rework or eliminate or bring up to date, yeah, that would probably be best to organize. All right. If there's nothing else on that, I can move on to the Go modules summary.
Please.
All right. So the KEP for this got approved as implementable this morning. Been in discussion for a couple weeks. Basically, Go modules have been coming for a while, and as of Go 1.12, they are available. And in Go 1.13, they will be on by default. And so now is the time to get Kubernetes working with them. In addition to just sort of keeping up with the Go ecosystem and not breaking people who start using, Go Get Kubernetes Client Go in the future, they actually have a lot of benefits for us. some immediate and some potential future benefits. So anyone who has ever tried to use GoDeps to update vendor tooling can appreciate that our current tooling is painful. And as a point of reference, switching from GoDeps to Go modules reduced the time to rebuild our vendor directory from 30 minutes in CI to 3 minutes. So it's a 10x increase, and it's even faster if you have local caches. So it makes it much nicer just to do normal things like bump a version of a dependency. In the future, if there's adoption of some of the more advanced versioning aspects of Go modules, we might be able to have multiple versions of Kubernetes libraries coexist side by side in a build. We can't do that yet for a few reasons. Not all of our dependencies support this advanced versioning, and we have not yet settled on switching to it because it's an irreversible decision. But it's something we could evaluate and potentially do in the future. So you can read the proposal, you can read the work in progress pull request that implements this, but the short version is that we will switch our vendoring tools to use Go modules, and we will publish Go module information for all of our staging components so that anyone who is relying on the components we publish out will have dependency information that will make it a lot easier for them to consume client Go and Kubernetes API machinery, things like that. So that's the 10,000 foot view and what we're going to do in 1.15. There are questions, quick questions about it now. I do plan to do a kind of a tech talk, what you need to know about Go modules that goes into more of the technical details. Probably do that with SIG API machinery. And I'll try to make sure that's recorded and sent out. So if you're interested in kind of the guts of how this works, we'll do that in a different context.
Yeah, I really like the idea of a tech talk and having that recorded because Go modules and Kubernetes, right? Like Kubernetes minor versions break the API expectation that Go modules have of semantic versioning with the API, and how are we going to handle that? I think explaining some of these things to folks, especially for those who vendor Kubernetes or parts of it, will be really beneficial. I like that idea. Thank you.
Jordan, does it make consuming KK directly any easier?
Kubernetes would have would provide more version information about its dependencies. So in that way, it would make it slightly easier. The real benefit for consumers is for people who are consuming the modules we publish.
I think philosophically we should keep and take and keep the line that nobody should vendor KK. And any excuse that people find to vendor KK is justification to break out new repos.
Yeah, do we have a way of collecting requests to vendor subparts of KK? Like Matt occasionally says, what about this? But I don't know if it does get filed as issues in KK, that's lost in the noise.
I mean, nobody needs to ask our permission, which is part of the problem.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, one tool available, which I know Clayton loves, which would be to move the entire thing under an internal directory, and Go's tooling would then stop people from being able to vendor KK except for the repos that we explicitly expose.
Yeah, I mean, people are copying code and adding and deleting stuff too. So it's not just vendoring in. So there's a few patterns that I've seen so far.
Yeah,
for example,
the switch doesn't make it worse. It makes it very slightly better just because we record, we want this particular version of this dependency, but it doesn't really change the picture for people who are vendoring Kubernetes.
I also want to point out, and like there's vendoring and carrying patches. I think the carrying patches is the thing that we need to be cautious about. Like I know lots of people who take Kube and they carry one patch for their production environments. So we should definitely not do anything that breaks that use case. That would be abusive to the open source community. Vendoring is definitely a more nuanced issue. I think just the code structure in general is like, part of the problem is that we don't have a lot of internal discipline. As we get better at discipline and split things out, these become less of an issue.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. Go modules do provide ability to replace things with your own patch version. It doesn't apply a patch, but it lets you to kind of track and control things if it's needed, the same way some of the existing tools do today.
I think one of our problems is not necessarily how our code is structured, but that we just don't have the ethos that we don't ever break people who are using the Go interfaces to our code.
Right. Clayton and I were talking about this. I feel like we have the mental energy to keep API compliance with one API. And for Kubernetes, that's like the REST APIs, right?
Yeah.
Like those are the ones that we pay attention to and don't break, and like put all our energy towards preserving. And it's like doing it on two fronts
yeah, we talked about this a little bit in API machinery, SIG API machinery yesterday, but yeah, it's like this does not mean that we won't break people. Like people will re-import and then have to make a bunch of code changes. Like this just makes it possible to consume with the new tools. I think we can and should think about addressing whether we like our users who are importing and using our Go interfaces, or whether we want them to continue to suffer. But that can be a separate step and should be a separate step.
Here's what I would suggest on this. We move these conversations about what we should do to either the code organization or API subprojects. I'm going to suggest code organization, and then we hash those out there, maybe collect who's importing what and how do we support them. But those become a focused effort under there, and probably not one of the highest priority efforts there, because we've got so many other things they need to do.
Right. The one other thing that I asked people that I met in KubeCon India was, how come you're not telling us that you're doing all this stuff? And you know, why do you need to do this? And they said, oh, okay, we were not sure whether this was the right thing to do or not. Was the main refrain.
I think the primary discoverability problem that exists with code organization and importing and usage is actually very difficult. And I try to point people in the right direction all the time, even though they're somewhat seasoned in the Kubernetes space.
Right. I think as a first step, we just have to collect more information about how people are using our stuff and get them to come to us and tell us how they're using things. I think that would be one of the things to do as well.
That sounds like a great task for the code organization subproject. Okay, in the interest of time, do we have other things we want to talk about regarding Go modules and dependencies? Thank you, Jordan, for all the work and for carrying this and putting it together. This is nice to see. So with that, the next thing we have on the agenda is breaking out the volume snapshot CRD libraries into a separate repo using the publishing bot. Do we have somebody on to talk about that?
Yes. Are we muted?
Yeah, we're
okay. Yeah. So to give some background, we have developed snapshot controllers in external repositories. And along with those controllers, we have a set of CRDs for snapshot. Right now, both the CRD APIs and the snapshot controller are in the same repository. And now we're running into issues where other consumers of the snapshot API end up having to inherit the Go dependency constraints of the snapshot controllers, even though the consumers only need the API part and not the controller part. So like some things we've had to do is if the consumers of the API need to go update their client Go version, like we have to go and update client Go in the snapshot or controller first before we can actually update the client Go in the consumers of the API, even though the snapshot controller technically doesn't need to update client Go. So we want to break that dependency, and one of the ideas I had was just to follow the way that we publish APIs in the main Kubernetes repo, which is to put them into staging and publish them out into another repository. And I just wanted to check if that is a good approach we should take, or if there are other alternatives we should consider.
So one alternative that we did consider was having a completely separate repository for the API, separate from the snapshot controller, that all other components could vendor in just like any other external dependency. The challenge with that is that if we make any changes to the API, ideally we want to be able to test it immediately with the external snapshot or controller. That is the controller that implements this API and definitely needs to validate it. So if we put the API in a separate repo, we would have to make that update, commit it, update the dependency on the external snapshot or repository to pick up the new API, test it, discover a bug, and then go back to the other repo to fix it and ping pong between them. So that's why this approach of the way that Kubernetes has done the staging repo is a little bit appealing. It's the API and the external controller can coexist. We can build and test them together. And once we have something stable, publish out the API, and then other consumers can simply import the API that is known to be stable.
All right. The only other option is the Git submodules, right? Git
Do we use Git submodules for anything right now?
The Python uses, right? The Python client.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Git submodules are terrible, and I would say, and in fact, I just ripped them out of the client Go library because they're hard for people to understand how to work with, and nobody actually uses them, and so nobody really understands how to work with them.
They make regular Git seem easy and usable by comparison.
Yeah, and then they also make like GitHub doesn't really know how to do them right either, so that you still have to like land a PR in a different place than the place where you go, and then vendor it into the like. I would recommend highly against them.
Okay, so then there is no alternative. This is what we need to do then.
I mean, there are alternatives around like working in multiple repos and coordinating them by having CI, where CI is the thing that joins and says, all right, before I merge this commit to the API repo, I'm going to, in CI, I'm going to actually make sure that head of the controller repo and this PR in the API repo like build and work together. Like there are options. Yeah, we don't have those tools today, but
that's the right way to do it.
Well, this sounds like it's exactly what the code organization and some of the
that's why it was useful to have this on the agenda today. But so does any of the code that uses the snapshot API actually exist in KK today?
No, but it's one of the external controllers that we ship, but it's not part of KK.
So moving it to staging would move it to KK.
The staging that we're proposing would be
to have a staging actually in the snapshot external.
Oh, I see.
New staging.
Bringing the staging concept to another repository, right, where you develop in a monorepo and then publish one of the things out.
Right? Yes.
That might be interesting as an exercise.
It's the pattern we have now, right?
Yeah, it's the pattern we have now.
For those people who are playing with Publishing Bot, like how antsy does that make you?
It's doable. I think Nikita took a look at it, and it's doable. But again, please, we need more hands on the Publishing Bot so we can cater to more use cases like this.
I would say if you're considering this, first investigate publishing separate Go modules from the same repo. I think that is a possible thing that you can do with the Go module stuff. Jordan probably knows more. I mean, it's not like an option for our current staging to move to that, but maybe if you start fresh.
Yeah. If the problem that you're trying to address is people having to pull in lots of dependencies, then a submodule, or like a module that just encompassed the API types would let people pull that in without pulling in all of the other controller related dependencies.
Okay. So
as long as those other users are using Go modules.
which is going to be universally true very soon.
Okay.
Yes.
So one suggestion is to investigate converting our current dependency management system from dep to Go modules.
Yes.
And isolating the API bits and the controller bits within the current repo, so that and you might be able to use some of like the import boss tools or even some of the Go tools to enforce that the API bits are only allowed to have this set of dependencies.
The relationship between repository and module is not one-to-one, right? And that's actually the thing that makes modules pretty powerful and confusing. But I sat and learned everything about modules just this week, and it only took me half a day to wrap my head around basic operation and convert one repo to use it. So
one thing that will make your life a lot easier is if you don't have to publish out modules to their own repos. So if the canonical place to consume them is within the single repository and their import path reflects that, so it'd be like, I don't know what your repo is, but k/controller/API. If the canonical path actually locates it within your repository, that will make it a lot easier for people to consume, and then you won't have to publish anything to independent repos. Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest, just in the interest of time, could you try converting to Go modules with a separate module for this? And then if that doesn't work, come back to us about the whole staging idea. Would that be possible?
That sounds good.
Seems like a good experiment.
Yeah, it'd be a good experiment, especially for Go modules in our community and everything. So thank you. So in the interest of time, I'd like to move on to the next thing because we've got 2 more items in about 15 minutes. The next one is Go inotify. There's a link to an issue here. I'm not sure. Do we have somebody on who can speak to this?
Yeah, I mean, Dims knows more about it than I do, but I added it to the agenda.
I did some homework too.
Since the code organization topic was the main topic generally for today, this is an example of an issue that comes up all the time. It's related to the external dependencies thing that Jordan talked about. So we don't need to make a decision here so much as just make sure that people are aware of it, and it's an example of the kind of thing that we need to be able to sort out pretty quickly.
I think it's a great example. So in prep for today, I looked at the agenda and I thought this one was interesting, so I went off and did a little bit of homework on it. The long story short is the module that we use was deprecated a long time ago as OS specific, and was replaced by an OS agnostic one, which doesn't have the same set of capabilities. And I looked at in Go.
Yeah.
And the generic FS Notify version doesn't support some of the events that we're using. It's not clear to me from looking at the FS Notify repo whether they want to. Like there's one comment thread open that suggested maybe they were, but then it was closed with no merge, and that was 1.5 years ago or something. So maybe they're open to our changes, and we should be deciding sort of as a project, do we spend energy to try to convert upstream projects to do the things we want to do? Do we just say fork it and bring it into our own project, which has happened through Jan. I don't think Jan's on the call, but Sigma on GitHub did that and forked it into his own space, the old inotify one. If maybe we just fix the bugs there, or we fork it into Kubernetes like we did for Klog and we fix the bugs there. We have a lot of options here, and I think it's actually really interesting to think about the pattern that we want to follow.
Right. Just a little bit more information. So both KK and CAdvisor both use one of these modules. And in CAdvisor, inotify has been used for a very long time. We switched to FS Notify, and then we vendored it into KK. And then what happened was we saw some flakiness in a CI job. So we went back to the previous version of CAdvisor, and then we turned back, reverted the CAdvisor back to inotify. This happened more than a year ago or so. So I was trying to track that information down, and we need. So the other option is to basically switch everything to FS Notify and fix all the problems as we go along.
So this is a classic case of absent an owner, nothing will happen. And if we can get somebody to volunteer for this, I don't think it's that hard of a technical problem. I would be happy along the code organization group to steer somebody in what I think are sort of the decision tree of how to proceed here. But it's going to require making some patches, doing some testing, talking to the FS Notify upstream maintainers and negotiating an API, et cetera. We just need somebody to do it.
Right. Definitely a shout out to Jan Sigma for creating his own repository and then letting us use it.
That's the beautiful thing about Go is he doesn't have a choice.
Okay, I'll try to find an owner as part of the code organization stuff.
Okay, and Dims, like I said before, you can count on me if it's a matter of helping to steer. I can make time for that. I looked at it today. I even started on the patch and then I backed away from it because I realized it would take a couple of days of time and I don't have that right now.
Understood. Thank you. That's about it on this one, Matt.
All right, fantastic, thank you. So then we have one last item on here, which is the API review on external config. It's a call for input. Clayton, your name's next to this one. Can you talk about it?
Sure. So yesterday, a discussion was triggered where someone asked about the stability of the VMware cloud configuration API or config file that's used to configure the cloud controller. They raised a whole bunch of issues. I asked Jordan, I was like, hey, Jordan, did you do the API review on changes to the cloud config? And he was like, no, Clayton, I didn't. And I was like, I wonder who did. So I was asking in SIG VMware, and we kind of spilled over into cloud provider. The general question, and I think the discussion we need to have is, we want to move components out. What are the implications for components that sit on the edge or enable the system that may or may not fall under conformance? Obviously, we want to make sure VMware keeps working, the VMware cloud provider keeps working as we release newer versions of Kubernetes. But does that mean that their config file format is an API that needs to be reviewed the same way we would review the kubelet config, kube control? And so this has been moved into an issue, and I think it'll fall under the API review subproject. It just wanted to surface the general discussion and make sure folks are thinking about, we have core APIs, and then we have a whole bunch of other stuff that to an external admin is an API that we support. And so we need to get a little bit crisper on where the boundaries stop as we move out of tree some of these core features.
Right. Some more context here. So each of the cloud providers have been maintaining their own configs. There has been no reviews from anybody else. Like I don't go review the VMware config, for example. But then most of us have made sure, all of us have made sure that the previous config is still honored when we make changes, like adding a new field by making use of proper defaults, things like that. Because we always get upgrade issues if we don't do that. So it's been working out that way so far.
Yep.
I don't know if that helps with the
discussion. The implication wasn't actually that we are breaking compatibility. It was, this is a good example of distribution is mostly working, and I'm really happy that we're not seeing that, but it wasn't immediately clear looking at that file, could I depend on that the same way that I could depend on, for instance, V1 core not getting regressed ever, so that as a consumer administrator or someone who supports customer whatever, like as a user, can I trust that config file? And I think it's a good statement for us to make, and then the teams to own the way that they already are.
Okay, I want to acknowledge Derek now.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So on that point, Dims, I agree that thus far we've done a good job. I think I was the one that raised this issue to Clayton recently. When you audit the existing set of cloud config options exposed across all of the cloud providers, you start to maybe observe things that are a bit like feature gates, where if a user was to ever turn it on their cluster, they could potentially never be able to turn it off clearly. And I don't think that type of understanding of, consumer beware is being consistently applied across these cloud configurations. And I think as a project, it's it's fair to say that they're woefully under-documented and yet are super critical to running properly on any infrastructure. And so I think like getting better discipline here across the community would be really helpful.
I agree, Derek, but for starters, not all of them are YAML either, right? So
yeah, I mean, they're not all YAML. They're a weird file format that it looks like INI or some type of thing like that. But if you look at the options within them, I think it's I think you would see like if you look at the vSphere one, they have about a number of configuration options. You look at the AWS one, there are things they're straight up described as a bit alpha and type of stuff where I don't think we're doing a service to our users to not clearly communicate what and how they are.
Stuff like this has been echoed in many forums over time. I've made this argument for a long time. In the architecture group, I don't know what carrot or stick policy we can enforce with regards to that fringe, other than to define the extension points more crisply.
Okay. Jordan?
I was going to say something similar to what Derek said. In my mind, the two things that are missing the most are documentation and unit tests. A lot of the tests that we have make sure that the current version of the code works with the current version of the config file, but there's nothing that would catch if the version that was supported in the last release suddenly start failing. I didn't say that was the only things missing. I just said those are the things most obviously missing. And having those two would improve a lot. As far as like carrot or stick, the only thing I can think of is putting the structs that load config in a package that focuses review, so that it needs an ACK from some set. It could be cloud provider API reviewers. Like it could be a group dedicated to that, but just so that they don't get changed accidentally or thoughtlessly. Some of them are copies of existing cloud provider config files, and so it might seem reasonable to take a current snapshot of whatever that cloud provider's config is and just drop it in and not really consider compatibility implications.
Yeah, at this point, only thing we can do is like write a guideline and make sure all the cloud providers like follow that guideline, which is, I can't think of anything else we can be doing.
Some of them don't support things like versioning because they are loading existing formats, and that can be okay as long as they're properly tested and we have things in place to keep us from regressing if those formats change.
I mean, honestly, Dims, as we discussed, I think some last week, some of them are having usernames and passwords exposed as plain text fields.
Right.
Without, so there needs to be some best practice that we can consistently apply.
Justin?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, the way we've used it on the AWS provider specifically has been, it is for very niche edge cases that we acknowledge are important, but which are not generally, so we don't want to say no to supporting them for those users, but it's not something that we expect most users to do. So if you set it, on your own head be it. And it's not documented because here be dragons, and I think it would be a perpetual V1 Alpha 1 API if we were to make it an API. At least this has been used so far. Now, maybe we shouldn't have done that, but that's sort of where we are in terms of how the AWS API or the AWS Cloud Config was used. And most users will never set it.
So I'm struggling with concrete action items that we can advise people to partake in, other than, yes, documentation, but we've known about that, and I've stated that unequivocally in many different fronts for a long time. But there's also standards that we want to apply so that they have some consistency across providers. But I don't know how we do that. How exactly would that fall underneath the core organization and structure or API group? Who would take ownership try to drive progress forwards here.
Remember, Tim, the code is already in external repositories, so we are not going to go chase them either.
But the integration pieces, the aspects of how it integrates with the core, we do control that.
No, just for example, when we completely remove OpenStack Cloud Provider, it's going to be in a separate repository, and none of us will have any notice of what's going to happen there.
But correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, like obviously we still have the in-tree cloud providers there, and they're still widely used by the community. And I thought even the cloud controller manager component is referencing the same serialization of those file formats that's in the existing in-tree cloud providers.
It's just a raw byte stream, not a format specifically.
So this is a wonderful conversation, but we are at time, as Jace nicely pointed out. So we need to continue this somewhere else. Can somebody volunteer to take this to the mailing list so we can continue this conversation between now and next week to kind of come to some conclusion?
Can we take this to the SIG Cloud Provider group and debate there instead of doing somewhere else?
Yeah, I'll add it to the next week's agenda.
Perfect.
Cloud Provider.
Thanks, Andrew.
All right. Then we've closed on that. And if you have further discussions on that, please go bug SIG Cloud Provider. And with that, thanks everyone. Have a wonderful couple of weeks, and we will be back here in 2 weeks' time for our next meeting. Thanks everyone.
Bye, everyone.